Hey YouTube, thank you so much for watching The Perspective. Subscribe, like, and comment on this video for more content. So Joe Biden released the American Jobs Plan, which is part 2 of his Build Back Better agenda. And this is going to push into the economy $2.65 trillion. Now, chances are this is not going to go through and come out of Congress the same way that it went in. And the reason why is because the Democrats have not gotten rid of the filibuster and they have a very, very slim majority, but it's $2.65 trillion spent into the economy. Now, I think that government has a role to play in infrastructure and roads and bridges and things like that. The government has a role to play there. It makes sense for the government to keep its roads and bridges up to par. But only, I think, less than 10% of America's infrastructure is owned by the federal government. And I think it's like 30% is owned by state and local governments. And then the rest is owned by the private sector. So with that being said, if the federal government just took care of its own infrastructure, the federal government could have high-grade infrastructure. And then states and localities, if they just took care of their own infrastructure, the government's infrastructure will be fine. When it comes to private infrastructure, to incentivize private companies to keep up their infrastructure, you make it more profitable and easier to do that by less regulation and less taxation, because then you're encouraging them and they're encouraged to keep up their own infrastructure and make sure that what they're servicing is good. $621 billion in transportation infrastructure. So divide it up, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but what stands out is $174 billion. The biggest chunk of that is going to invest in electric vehicles, consumer rebates and grants, and other incentives to build 500,000 new charging stations for those electric vehicles. I think like 3% of Americans own electric vehicles. And the crazy thing is that there's already plenty of companies that are investing in electric vehicles. That's true. So my biggest concern here is that this money is going to go to those corporations. It's going to go to big corporations who are going to get this money. Their stocks are going to go up. So you've created, more wealth, more income inequality, because you're literally giving money to these companies, which are already doing it, by the way. Electric vehicles are not infrastructure. Like, that's not infrastructure of what you would think of when you think of infrastructure. I definitely don't think that this big of a portion of the plan should be going towards electric vehicles. That's insane to me. And especially not corporations, billion-dollar corporations. $590 billion is it being invested in domestic manufacturing, research and development, as well as job training. This is mostly all corporate welfare, and it's senseless corporate welfare. You're talking about subsidizing manufacturing companies that are either failing, so are not profitable, and we're going to keep them alive with taxpayer money. We're going to subsidize or pay for their inefficiency just so that we can claim we have domestic manufacturing. This to me is more MAGA ideology, make America great again, industrial America, protectionist America, than a lot of what Donald Trump did. And $400 billion is going to home care and home care workers. Again, this is not infrastructure. This is not the federal government taking care to make sure that its own infrastructure is top notch. This is the federal government spending money, calling it infrastructure. Probably a small percentage is going to take care of the federal government's infrastructure. So the federal government's infrastructure is still going to look crappy because the federal government is doing so many other things in this bill, so many other things that are not infrastructure. $400 billion for clean energy tax credits. This is going towards building affordable housing, clean energy affordable housing, giving money to schools to rebuild schools, childcare tax credits. How is affordable housing infrastructure? That money could be taken to spend on actual federal infrastructure to make the federal infrastructure better. The public schools, what public schools are owned by the federal government? Those are operated by states and localities, and states and localities should be responsible. First of all, the federal government does not know how to balance its budget. That's the first thing. The second thing is that essentially you're going to have people living in New York paying for the schools of people living in Mississippi, because the federal government is going to collect from everybody and then redistribute it to where it thinks that money is needed. $311 billion on broadband, electric grid, and water. This bill is, and I'm just grading it based off of infrastructure. Like, is it actually revamping the United States federal government's infrastructure? No. The little that it is doing is not enough to actually deal with the infrastructure, because so much of the bill is going towards other things.